In our last episode, we explored whether Italy's quest for a unified nation was a unification or an occupation of the South. In this episode, we examine whether unification played any role in Italy's greatest export, its people, and what precipitated the Great Assimilation, Italian immigrants in their fervent quest to become American. In the first wave of Italian immigration, over 4 million people left Italy, most from the South. What pushed so many people from the Mezzogiorno to the shores of Ellis Island? Dr. Stanislao Pugliese is a professor of European history at Hofstra University.
You know, immigration historians talk about push and pull factors, right? Mm-hmm. So the push factors were that, life was getting worse in the South. People could see that if we stayed here, nothing was going to change. In fact, things might even be worse for my children. Like my grandparents, they have, 5 daughters. How are they going to marry 5 daughters with no dowry, no land, right?
Additionally, the invention of the steamship made transatlantic travel much easier and safer. Dr. Salvatore Di Maria is a professor of Italian history at the University of Tennessee.
Before, to get across the Atlantic, you took a sailing ship. You know what a sailing ship was? It was called a death coffin. Because people would die. It would take like 40, 50 days to get from here to there. By then, these ships were small. And they were at the mercy of the wind, at the mercy of the current, and so on. So, and it was expensive because they only bring a small number of people. And, they don't have that much opportunity to feed these people and so on. Some of them would starve by the time they got to where they were going.
But problems did still exist on steamships.
Very class conscious, right? So passengers in the steerage class were not allowed above, on the upper decks. They had to eat amongst themselves. Really terrible, terrible conditions.
Additionally, steamships could carry many more passengers than the old sailing ships.
A steamship can carry 3 times to 4 times as many as passengers, has regular scheduled voyages, cost much, much, much less, was much more secure than the other ones, so it became easier. Then Mr. Ferreira immigrated 5 or 6 years ago, starts writing home, and say, hey, I got work here. Hey, I'm doing okay. And the neighbors say, wait a minute, I can do that too. Mm-hmm. So immigration engenders immigration.
Many Italian immigrants in the beginning of the 20th century benefited from the industrialization of America and sought jobs like those here in the mills of Lymansville, Rhode Island.
At one point in the South, they had close to 5,000 labor agents going around and trying to convince people to immigrate. And Argentina offered all sorts of rights. The moment you got off the boat, you had citizen rights. You had all sorts of care. They would transport you to the job where you had to go. And if something happens to you, they would repatriate you free and give your family so much money for that.
But not all roads in the United States were lined with gold. Sometimes immigrants were exploited.
There were a lot of problems when they reached the United States because they would say, okay, I have a job lined up for me in Pennsylvania in a coal mine, right? And they would literally get off the boat in Ellis Island. An agent would be there, put them on the railroad, go to Pennsylvania, and they would find themselves in some coal town where, they had to rent their apartment from the coal company. They had to buy their food from the coal company. They had to buy their clothes from the coal company. By the end of the month, they actually owed the coal company money rather than getting paid. So it was like indentured servitude.
Also, not all immigrants went to the industrialized North.
There was a pipeline between Sicily and New Orleans, specifically for Sicilian immigrants, landless immigrants who wanted to work the land. They didn't want to go to New York City. They wanted to get their own land. They ended up in Louisiana in the South, and they ended up being like sharecroppers working side by side with African Americans who had been just freed from the Civil War 1 generation earlier.
Adjusting to life in the United States was not easy for Italian immigrants.
As a friend of mine wrote in a memoir, the Italians, they got on a boat in Naples in the Middle Ages. They slept in the Atlantic Ocean, and then they woke up in New York in the 20th century. I've oftentimes asked myself, and I've been back and forth many times. I've been to my mother's town, my father's town. My father's town was a little better off than my mother. My mother, landless peasants. My father was a carpenter, so his family was a little better off. But it's like, what was it in them that made them be able to do this kind of spostamento? I don't know how you would say it in English. This displacement, from let's say rural Italy after the Second World War to New York in the 20th century, and not suffer any kind of like psychological trauma or setbacks or, it wasn't easy. They're the first ones to tell you, right?
Landing on American soil, Italian immigrants did not speak the language and knew very few people, if any.
I have this theory that the people who are immigrants are what I call the Italian Puritans, the ones that have that kind of puritanical work ethic. Right, they were the ones who said, like, I could work like a dog here for the rest of my life and nothing's going to happen. But if I go to America, I still will have to work like a dog, but at least my children's lives will be better.
There were immigrants who found life in America much too difficult and fast-paced compared to life in rural southern Italy. Some even decided to move back. Then there was the discrimination. One of the great ironies is that Southern Italian immigrants often faced discrimination from the earlier wave of immigrants who came from the North and were much more educated.
These Italians from the South, they're not like us. We are descendants of Leonardo da Vinci and Galileo and Michelangelo. We're from Venice or Florence or whatever, right? Those people, they're from Africa.
Many immigration authorities accuse Southern Italians of being violent.
They accused the Southerners of being have animal instincts. They went for the knife immediately in an argument. Well, I argued, and I think I'm right, you don't know the language. When you don't know how to express yourself, just like an animal, you turn to violence. You see what I'm trying to say? If you're civilized, you use words, you use rhetoric, you use whatever it takes to argue, to defend yourself. But if you are illiterate, what do?
Thus begins the Great Assimilation. First-generation Italian Americans have one simple choice: fit into American society or move back home.
Right. So, one way to do this is to change your name. Some people did this voluntarily. Some people had this imposed upon them. Right? There's like many memoirs that say, I went to school on the first day and, the teacher said, what's your name? And my name is Giovanni. He said, no, your name is Johnny. My name is Maria. No, your name is Marie. Right. So this kind of, both from outside, the pressure to anglicize, to become American, and also it's internalized, right? Like people don't want to be the black sheep in their class. They don't want to be ostracized, right? So why do you want to be like made fun of with a name like Stanislao, like me, when you can be called Stan, right? So you anglicize yourself.
Many Italian immigrants assimilated into American society through a mass Anglicization that included not passing down their particular dialect while trying to hang on to some traditions in the home.
I wouldn't say it like everybody. At the same time, people felt that they had to hold on to some aspects of their culture, right? And that usually meant things like religion, food, family, all of the usual stereotypes of Italian American culture. It was the way that we tried to maintain some cultural identity without being melted into that melting pot. That metaphor of the melting pot, I tell my students, like, if you take metals and you put them in a pot and you melt them down, you no longer can distinguish between the gold and the silver and the bronze and the copper. So what people use now is like the salad bowl metaphor, like in a salad bowl, you put different ingredients, the tomatoes and the olives and the cheese and the lettuce and the spinach and the walnuts and the feta cheese, and you mix it all together. and they become something different, but the individual parts retain their concrete characteristics.
Sicilian parliamentarian Napoleon Coliani once said that Southern Italians are a people capable of emancipation once outside the environment that oppressed them. So would you say that the successes of many Southern Italians in the United States are a testament or prove that statement correctly?
That's exactly what I said in that book. And I strongly believe that because you and I, especially I being the first generation, can attest to that. I grew up in a very poor environment. If you see some pictures of Afghanistan now, that's where I grew up. No running water, no electricity, no nothing. Well, if I stayed there, I don't know what would have happened. But coming to this country, I managed to become a university professor.
Immigrants were reticent about their experiences, choosing not to speak about what their lives were like in Italy and the struggles they endured when they arrived here in the United States.
Why didn't my parents tell me about this? And I have the same problem. I'm actually first generation.
Oh, okay. Yep.
My parents were born in Italy. They came to America, my mother in the mid-50s, my father in 1962, and they never spoke about, their lives. We have to drag things out of them, and partially it was because, my father was like a young boy during the war. My mother was born during the war. They have a lot of bad memories, so part of it is psychological. And part of it is why do we want to burden our kids with these stories kind of thing, which now we regret.
One of the vehicles that helped Italian immigrants assimilate in the early 20th century was mutual aid societies.
Because we now know that there were all of these societies that helped immigrants, these Società di Mutuo Soccorso, mutual aid societies, right? And you would pay dues I don't know, 50 cents a month. And they would hold classes, literacy classes. They would help people if, the father got, laid off on the job. They might even help your family pay for a funeral if, God forbid, the father died or something, So there was a sense of, collective, responsibility, which was very important.
So as Italian immigrants rushed to assimilate, many choosing not to pass down their language to their children, changing their names, working in factories or coal mines, their cultural identity became transformed in American life, leaving the narrative of the Italo-American to be written, in many cases, by others.
We have to write our stories, otherwise our stories are going to be written by other people or not written at all. Part of what you're struggling with is also what a friend of mine, her name is Edvige Giunta. She teaches at New Jersey State College, one of those colleges, the field of memoir. And if you come across names like Louise DeSalvo or Eddie Giunta or Joanna Claps Herman, these are all Italian-American women who are writing about their parents, their grandparents, And that's become a new field just in the last 20 years.
As their memories faded and a new type of Italian was born, generations of Italian Americans are now reaching back to the past to find their histories and tell their own stories. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past.